Okay, this is not a lot. This is not on at all, is it? It is. You're getting me? Okay, awesome. All right, it's 4 o'clock. We'll get started. I am Dr. Daniel Gronsky. With me is the inimitable Meg Eden, author of Post High School Reality Quest, available wherever fine books are sold, which includes right here. In fact, after this panel, you should all run up here and just like throw money at her, just like literally throw money at her. Okay, so if any of you guys saw me here last year, you saw me give a panel on death in video games. And this year, I want to talk to you guys about nostalgia, because I'm getting old and there's so little time left. But it's a great topic to dig into. It's really, there's a lot of games getting into the nostalgia racket right now, and some of them really aggressively. And as it goes, yes, we will probably bring up Ready Player One a couple of times here today.
Yeah.
All right. So, as it turns out, this panel is the story of a game. That's usually how these things get started for me. It's actually a story of 2 games. One I played and one that you'd probably have to pay me to play. If you paid me to play it, I would absolutely play it. Back in April, I made a purchase. I bought Cosmic Star Heroine from Z-Boyd Games. Anybody play Cosmic Star Heroine? All right, the rest of you guys, this is an awesome game. You should totally play it. So the thing is, while I'm downloading the title, I get an ad for another game. I get an ad for a game called Saturday Morning RPG. And that groan tells me some of you have seen that. Apparently, the PlayStation Network thought I would like that game. The PlayStation Network was incorrect. So I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about, why? Why is this suddenly a thing that we're doing? Mm-hmm. And so that got me kind of thinking on the topic of nostalgia. And I think before we really get into any of the deep cut stuff, before I can even really talk about the games or the ads for the games, we got to talk about what is nostalgia, right? So, what is nostalgia? I think we all know the dictionary definition, right? But I think the dictionary definition is wrong when you get right down to it. The dictionary definition, I've actually got it right here. A sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. And in thinking about this, I came up with the idea that I don't think it really is about trying to return to a better time or a longing for a better time. It's a longing for a better you. It's sort of romanticizing yourself, remembering when you were younger, when you were stronger, or even if you go way back to childhood, when you were safer, when you had less responsibilities. It's not romanticizing the past, it's romanticizing you. And looking at it that way, I think, gave me a lot more useful, was a much more useful lens for looking at the topic. And by the way, you guys are being super respectful and paying great attention. If anybody wants to jump in on this at any moment, because I have all these talky points here, but it's a rough guide to the afternoon, guys. If anybody wants to get in on this, throw your hands up in the air like you care very much, and we'll try to pick some of you guys out and hit you as we go. So the thing is, if nostalgia is a better you, that makes it extremely personal, right? That means it's an exclusive definition. So my past is not your past. What I'm going to be nostalgic for, you won't be nostalgic for. And it segments into groups, it segments into generations, but you still have those really sharp divides. And that means if a game is nostalgia focused, there's going to be big segments of the audience that are just not going to be into it, are not going to get it, are not going to care. And actually, I even found a quote from a Cherie Thrasher, who's the public advertising manager for Coca-Cola of North America, which I thought was a pretty good source for that. Completely agreeing with that point. The idea that nostalgia advertising is divisive. It breaks you into groups. And the thing is, so then what's the pull of nostalgia here? Because AAA design is all about, let's grab the biggest group. Let's get the most people, I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but the lowest common denominator, this is going to prevent that. So again, why? I even say, there's definite appeal here. Like, I'm not saying there isn't. I mean, the title of the panel is "Nostalgia is a Drug." But
and the room's full.
Yeah. So. But, what is that appeal, And part of it's the definition I gave, for folks like me, we're a certain age, I want to feel younger, better, less jaded, whatever. But there's some other reasons, too, that nostalgia's got its hooks in you, regardless of how old you are. One of the big ones I found actually has a lot to do with anxiety, believe it or not. Like when people are anxious about the future, when they don't know what the next day is going to hold, they want those comforting thoughts from, a time that they understood. And when you're nervous, you will look for comfort in the past, but not just your past either. Any past, because it's a known quantity. So that's one of the hooks. It's a longing for a more optimistic time. That's actually the etymology on this. Nostos, returning, and algos, suffering. Return from suffering. That's what nostalgia means. So, hey, you learned something. There's another slightly happier theory put forth about what the pull for nostalgia is that has to do with social connectedness. And more or less is what it sounds like. It's the measure of how people come together and interact. It's the quality and number of connections. So not just how many people you can connect with, but how good those connections are. Let's see. All right. I got a source here. I got a cite on here, which is James Madigan. He wrote an article called "The Psychology of VGT Nostalgia," and this is where I realized that my notes meant more to me several weeks ago than they do right now. I apologize. Jamie Madigan, Google him. You'll find the article. It's actually a really good article. Apologize. For gamers, our most nostalgic memories often revolve around sharing the hobby with others, making new friends through gaming, and enjoying a good couch co-op experience. And of course, we're at a con for gaming. I don't need to say this out loud, but I'm going to anyways. Games are innately pretty social, right? We're all here interacting with each other. I'm sure at least some of you guys popped up to the tabletop and just rolled into a game with a bunch of people you've never met before because it needed 8 to 12 players or whatever. And then, when on the electronic front, MMOs or MOBAs, stuff like that, those have been getting huge traction. Everything's got a huge online component now because they want to roll in that multiplayer experience. So games themselves are social because they're socially connected. That dials into the nostalgia aspect. All right, so altogether, nostalgia reinforces one's best sense of self, alleviates sadness and anxiety, and builds a sense of community and belonging. So what's the appeal? A lot, actually. It's got a lot of strong appeal.
Can I ask something real quick before we go forward? So it's interesting that, the idea of nostalgia is personal and subjective, yet the community sense is so vital, and we group ourselves in communities with nostalgia. Like right now, the 80s are super in, and things about 80s nostalgia, and we kind of, whether we're of that generation or not, we collectively engage with that. So I'm interested in.
And you can kind of track it too, because a couple 10 years ago, the 70s were real big, right. And you can kind of see the 90s creeping up.
Yeah.
So
it's almost like high school reunions that go.
Yeah, in a sense. Oh, we got a question? Comment?
Yeah, based on that, I just remember somebody said something about the people with the strongest feelings about a particular time are often not the people who are directly in that time, the next generation after. So, for instance, Back to the Future, when that was made, that was the generation right after the 50s. So a lot of it was them looking back on the fond memories at that time.
And even if you look at people like me who are nostalgic for the movie Back to the Future, I was 7 when that came out, okay? So, that movie was not made for me. But as a 7-year-old, I had a lot more leeway to romanticize the things about that movie as a cultural product, about the things that were going on in that time. And that seems rosier to me as an adult, even though I've read history books. I know a little better.
But I guess when we remember the most positive things typically, and so then we pass that down to the next generation. So they're inheriting our positive memories of it when they're looking at the past.
And that's totally true. Your memory will function that way. You find it easier to remember good things than bad things.
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't always seem like that's true.
Yeah.
Did it ever bother you that they invented him hating being called a chicken in the second movie just to invent a subplot?
I was 8 when the second one came out, so no.
I didn't realize that until a few years ago.
I didn't get into actual film criticism for many more years.
I think also too, everything, the universe kind of runs on a cycle. One of the things I teach family consumer science, and then one of the things I talk about a lot in my fashion classes, if you look at the fashions of different eras, things just keep coming around in different ways, but it keep coming around. So is this all part of that cycle that we're all trapped or part of?
That is going to tie in really nicely to something we're going to talk about later in the panel. Anybody else? Oh, one in the back.
Do you think that there's a cycle to nostalgia? Like, take for instance, the movie National Lampoon's Vacation. Originally, it was written in, I believe, the early 70s as sort of this cynical look back on the 50s family vacation. It's just really dark, and it's said it, and it just shows that the whole thing was a train wreck. Where when they made it into a film 10 years later, it was more of like, boy, what if that worked? What if, like, it's still a complete mess, but still it's looked at in a better tone. So do you think that there is a cycle to nostalgia where we specifically can take something and say, that was stupid, and then 10 years down the line, it turns and becomes something greater?
I would say yeah.
I would agree with that, but I would also say that there's probably a lot of other factors in that as well. For starters, when you look at any kind of mass media product, when you look at movies, when you look at games, it's easier to upsell a happy story than it is a sad story. That's that lowest common, again, not to be dismissive of the concept, but that's the lowest common denominator effect happening again there. I'll probably say that more in this panel, and I want to be real clear. I don't mean that as necessarily a bad thing.
I think with time we kind of maybe hone into different aspects of something nostalgic, depending on what's culturally happening around us. So perhaps we'll look at something that we thought was stupid initially and then find something of value based on the context we're in. And maybe that's why we would hone in and we kind of create cycles based on the spirit of the age that we're in.
Yeah, I like that. All right, so we've been talking about generic definitions and we've been talking about movies from the 80s. Ooh. Maybe we should talk about games. How does that sound here at MAGFest? All right. We were sort of setting up the panel ideas, tossing stuff back and forth a couple weeks ago. And Meg, actually, I got to credit her for this, came up with the idea of viewing it through the lens of, okay, there's the concept of making something brand new from old parts, recreating an experience that the same exact experience that you had when you were a kid or you had back many years ago, and the concept of imitation, which is basically, hey, remember that thing. And I think that's a really, really excellent way to look at this stuff. And I kind of want to go through these in reverse order. I want to start with imitation. Hey, remember that thing. And again, the game that kind of got me started down this path, or the trailer that got me started down this path was for the game Saturday Morning RPG. Imitation is kind of like an empty homage, a recreation. It's not necessarily a bad experience, but a lot of times it is because it's the thing without the core element that made you love that thing. Mm-hmm. And so Saturday Morning RPG, how many of you guys have either played that or at least seen the trailer for it? A handful of you guys. All right, so it's literally just a barrage of 80s nostalgia junk. Transformers, G.I. Joe, He-Man, Star Wars, Back to the Future. And for what it's worth, I did not see a ton of like feminine products in that trailer. I think I saw a Care Bear in there. I'm pretty sure I saw a Care Bear in there, but that was it. So I didn't see anything like Barbie. I didn't see anything like Gem, which was a monster property in the 80s. If I'm being honest, that's kind of an emblematic problem for this kind of nostalgia too. It tends to be very aggressively masculine. And I don't necessarily know what that means. Maybe you should talk to, I fancy myself as a smart guy, but maybe you should talk to somebody smarter than me. It's a little outside my area of expertise, and I won't speculate on it. But you do see that a lot. You see that real masculine sense of nostalgia. And again, I said we were going to talk about Ready Player One probably a couple times. This is one of those times, right? One of the most biting criticisms I've seen of the book and the trailer for the film. For the record, I have not read the book. I'm just going to be clear about that. It didn't look good to me, so I didn't read it. But one of the most biting criticisms I saw that is somebody pointed out all the, in like the opening passage, like all the Back to the Future, Transformer stuff, just highlighting me like, if you replace this all with girl stuff, they'd have thrown this manuscript in the trash. And if you're being honest, you have to admit they were right. But so you wind up kind of ultimately with like this thin premise as based on better stuff that you already have access to, right?
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I think something that like makes those things unsuccessful, I think you can integrate properties into a product, but the integration is lacking purpose. Like with seeing the Saturday morning RPG commercials, was like, whoa, let's put all these things and throw them in a room and see what happens. And if you guys watch Nostalgia Critic, I think he did a review on Christmas Story 2, and the theme through that was first movie. We do this because first movie. And I think that like a lot of things with the nostalgia, like they're going on the nostalgia train, it's for that same reason, because hey, this was a thing before. And so if it's not being done purposefully and there's not like a reason to be doing it, then that's going to fall apart. There's no skeleton, no binding.
It's like I don't need to pick on Saturday Morning RPG just a little bit more. I don't need to play that game to remember Back to the Future.
Right.
We've just proved that, right?
Yeah.
I don't need to play that game to remember Star Wars. It's doing okay. If I want this stuff, I've got this stuff. So they're kind of hoping that my fondness for the one will magically translate to the other, but they're not giving me anything to love about that product. It's just my love for the other stuff. And that sort of came up again too, and I got another example for this one, which was Mighty Number 9. If you guys followed the story of Mighty Number 9. So, okay, how many of you guys know who Mega Man is? All right, there we go. Keiji Inafune, who was the director for Mega Man 3 onward, he left the company a handful of years ago. He left Capcom a couple years ago. And he was going to make a game that was a spiritual successor to the Mega Man franchise called Mighty Number 9. And it had, a lot of the stuff. It had Robot Masters, had power stealing, had the stuff that you expect from Mega Man. Unfortunately, it overwhelmingly failed to capture people's imaginations. Like, it didn't work as a standalone product. The gameplay was janky. The graphics weren't up to scale. It didn't come together. It was a failed Mega Man project is what it was. And no matter how much you loved Mega Man, you weren't going to love Mighty Number 9 because it wasn't a good game. And that's basically why I consider this kind of imitation to be sort of the laziest, least useful kind of nostalgia. It doesn't take you anywhere new. It doesn't give you anything new to love. That's not something you're going to be nostalgic for 20 years in the future. All right. So, question, you and then you.
Not so much of a question, but that's just what you said there sort of made me think of it. So, do you think maybe then it would be a bit more appropriate to sort of look at nostalgia as not like do you think it can be really a primary driving factor on its own, or is it better sort of served as an amplifier when you have something else that's already there, like a driving force to begin with, and it just expands upon it?
I absolutely think that if the rest of your elements are in order, that nostalgia can be the core driving appeal of the product. But if that's all that you have, you will drop off very suddenly. Metaphor I've been getting a lot of mileage out of this weekend, actually, is like steak. Steak is great. You go to a restaurant, they don't just put a steak on a plate in front of you. There's all kind of stuff that comes with that meal, and it's not a full meal without that stuff. Gentleman next to you.
And then I really like talking about that with my number 9 and parts of that. Then what stands on like remasters? Like we just saw the Insane trilogy last year, or was it the year before? We saw the DuckTales HD remastering. What's like the stance on that? Like just remaking the same game, updated graphic. Is that like trying to just totally blow it off, or is that also trying to grab new people with shiny product?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That was actually something I thought about too, and I think it depends on how it's done. So this might be a controversial example, but I'm a big Fire Emblem person, and I've been playing the Shadows of Valencia remake recently, and I feel like it was a failed attempt to recreate the first game because I felt like, to me, there were innovations done to that series that were profitable and beneficial that we had learned over time of how to do things better. And this game was just like, well, let's just recreate all the things that made the first Fire Emblem games really annoying to play and just do that because the first game had that. And we're making the first game. So it was like a very literal translation of the first game, when I feel like it would have been much more successful if they said, hey, here are things we've learned that make Fire Emblem games even better. Like, so let's add those to the original game to make it almost like how Shovel Knight is like how we remember retro games being. Like, it's not that they were like, oh, let's just literally, like, I think Shovel Knight's a fantastic contrast to Saturday Morning RPG, because it was, let's take all the things that were really good in games that we remember, put them together and create a new property that innovates on that. So when I play it, I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm playing a game as a kid again, but there's not all the annoying things that weren't perfected about making a game from that time. They learned from the past. And so I think that there's some element of learning and innovation that makes a successful remake.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of dipping into some of the other two categories that we're going to be covering in a minute here too, creating and recreating. Especially if you look at something like DuckTales, which is, pardon me, didn't want to cough into the mic there. If you look at something like DuckTales, which if you play the original DuckTales on the NES, is a great game. It is a ton of fun. If you take the exact same game and make it prettier, swell. But you didn't really do much, but okay, it's still fun. You look at something like the Odin Sphere remaster they did a couple of years ago. That they made drastic tweaks to the gameplay in that. And so you actually had a game that in a lot of ways was a new game. And there are different ways to approach that. I think all of them are kind of valid, if at least what you have underlying is a good, fun game. In the middle.
What's your subjective opinion on nostalgia being used as a cash grab for consumers? Because it feels immediately it's currently in the form of reboots, remasters, adaptations. And do you feel it's hurting the creative source to create new things because it's easier to rely on an individual's nostalgia to make them happy?
I think it's become, like you're saying, problematic, because I think of like the Gem and the Holograms movie remake that had nothing to do with that, but it didn't.
Try not to think of that.
Yeah,
You
like
just
that
hurt
movie
yourself.
didn't happen, but it didn't innovate. It, like you're saying, it purely relied on nostalgia. I think a positive of that, though, is it's allowed us to kind of bring some trademarks back to light, like because it's a cash grab. So I guess the reality is that if the money's going there, then it's allowing us to draw attention back to certain things, which I guess I thought is kind of cool.
And it's always hard to face up to the fact that literally everything is a cash grab. They want your money. They want it back. Give your money to Meg instead.
Yes.
They want your money, and if you give them your money, they'll keep doing that thing. It's if you reward them, they will keep doing it. And I understand it's not always your call. Sometimes somebody else just spoke for you with their wallet. And personally, I kind of agree. I'd love to see more new ideas, more new properties. But I think eventually, no bubble lasts forever. It will pop. We'll get something fresh. We'll get something exciting. And there's always games, movies, TV, everything. There's always somebody doing something crazy out there and not getting recognized too.
Well, and I'd argue something like Stranger Things has benefited from that we've had some really innovative, interesting ideas be able to benefit from that trend.
All right. Let's take one more and then move into recreating. So right up front.
Yeah, so for Christmas, this. I actually just got the 2016 Doom for my Switch, and just like Shovel Knight, that's another terrific example of like innovating on those classic elements. And I was like blown away by this game. It is really good.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right, so let's move it forward to recreating. And the idea behind recreating is that you're delivering what is technically a new experience. It's not an old game. It's not something you've done before, but it's using a familiar IP and delivering it in a really familiar way. It's trying to recreate that feeling, that sensation of having played that game or watched that film from before. Probably the best example I can give you guys is Sonic Mania. Where it's like, hey, it's Sonic again! And people love that. People ate that up because they wanted Sonic again because it had been so long since they'd had Sonic. And that's a better approach, I feel, than raw imitation because they are doing something new. Not new, not innovative, but new in the sense that I haven't played these levels before. I'm not just doing a thing I've done before, but I'm doing a thing that is familiar, that is comforting, and is fun. And the thing is, that was the trick about Sonic Mania. Like if you talk to people who played it, people who loved it, big Sonic fans, it wasn't just, hey, Green Hill Zone. Remember Green Hill Zone? We got Green Hill Zone. It was new zones, new areas, and everything still felt like Sonic. Still felt like you were playing a new Sonic game from like 1995. And that's there was a market for that. People wanted that. And it seems simple, but it's a critical element that a lot of the lower end stuff that we were talking about before misses. It's not fun in the same way the original was fun. And a big thing, I keep coming back to it too. A big part of what the variations here are on, what's good nostalgia, what's bad nostalgia. Is it fun? Are you having fun? Are you enjoying yourself? Because if you're not, that's garbage, and don't waste your time on it. Yeah. And in fact, let me pick on Ready Player One more time. So here's the thing. Ready Player One is like, hey, remember Star Wars? Hey, remember Indiana Jones? Here's the thing. Star Wars and Indiana Jones were nostalgia products. Star Wars was inspired by, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers. Indiana Jones was based on old movie serials, old adventure movie serials. You get 15 minutes at a time. And what those movies, Star Wars and Indiana Jones, what they did is they took the core experience of those old movies and translated that into something that was new in the 70s and the 80s. Something, that had that familiar flavor, that had a comforting experience, but was a new story, was new characters, new environment. And did something, again, they didn't reinvent the wheel, but they did something fresh. And stuff like Ready Player One, stuff like Saturday Morning RPG isn't doing that. All right.
I was just going to talk about, I guess, the next stuff, yeah.
Okay. I guess, the other game I kind of had here for recreation, actually, Thimbleweed Park. If anybody played Thimbleweed Park. Nobody played. One guy played Thimbleweed Park. Did anybody play Maniac Mansion? All right, we got a few more hands. It's by some of the same developers as Maniac Mansion. It's sort of a spiritual... All of them. Okay.
All three of them.
Okay. So it's a spiritual successor. It's a throwback homage, but it's a new story. It's a new environment. It's new characters. It's meant to feel like you're playing Maniac Mansion, but you're playing something new. And in general, people feel like it worked. People enjoyed that experience. They enjoyed Thimbleweed Park.
Well, and that one's one that could kind of go into the next category, I think, of new experience based on invoking past experiences.
Yeah, because they did some fresh stuff in that too. The big one in Thimbleweed Park is they put a hint system in. Have any of you guys played a point-and-click adventure of any kind? How many of you find them unsolvable without a FAQ? Thimbleweed Park tried to alleviate that problem. They put in a hint system. You could talk to people, you get banter, you get hints that point you in the right direction. And so that sort of is one of those great ideas that bridges us into the idea of creation now. Something brand new, taking familiar elements, taking something that you you know something that you can point to and say, aha, I see where this came from, but just doing something completely fresh, something completely innovative with it. You gotta look forward sometime. To go back to the question we had there about, is all this nostalgia hurting creativity? Is the fact that we're getting 17,000 Star Wars movies a year mean that there's no new sci-fi coming out? Eventually, there's got to be something fresh, or our creative society grinds to a halt.
My understanding of why we're seeing so many, or one of the big reasons we're seeing so many sequels now is that movies and games keep getting more and more expensive to make. And so, there's a lot more pressure for developers to make something, safe that is guaranteed to get a return.
That's true, and also not true. And what I mean by that is, yes, developers, film and game developers are spending millions and hundreds of millions more dollars on more stuff. They don't seem to realize that's their decision, and they don't have to do that. Because I can't tell you how many things how many movies I've watched, how many games I've played, where they've done it on a shoestring budget, and they got creative to work around the limitations of having that shoestring budget. And what I got was something fun and something amazing. I don't even mean at the dirt indie level either. I mean, did anybody in here see Looper from a couple years ago? That was not a movie with a huge budget. It had a couple of big stars in it, but they didn't spend a fortune on it. It was new. It was innovative. It has great world building. It is one of my favorite movies. I recommend it wholeheartedly. There's so many games. I just mentioned Odin Sphere. Vanillaware was a 12-person company when they put that out, and they made so much money off of that game because they didn't invest that much money in it in the first place. You can create these experiences. Either like nostalgia, like we're talking about here, or completely fresh. You don't have to break the bank to do it. They just keep thinking that that's their only option. I mean, and even. One more thing before we get back on track. Even the Justice League movie. How much money did they spend on the Justice League movie? And not only was it bad and reductive and empty nostalgia, but it didn't even look good. Like, I don't know what they spent the money on.
But there is an investment. Like, I think of Cuphead. I mean, they had remortgage their house to make that. Now, they were really going all the way. They were like, we're going to jump in. We're going to fully jump in and hand animate everything and stuff like that. But so I guess it depends on where you're coming from and what you're trying to accomplish with it.
All right. Any other questions before we keep going? Oh, one more.
What are your thoughts on the game Broforce?
I'm sorry, on what?
Broforce?
Broforce? I don't know that one.
I'm not
sorry.
familiar
I'm
with
sorry. Does anybody else know that one? All right, a couple of you guys know that one. Speak on it a minute.
Yeah, I watch my kids play it mainly, but it's a very heavily 90s nostalgia-driven side-scroller platform game. It's got characters like Terminator and Rambo and RoboCop are not really them.
Oh, okay.
License issues, but I thought it was really fun and well done nostalgia kind of game. Just
Right. And again, keep it real simple. If it's fun, it's good.
I just want to ironically go backwards for a second.
Oh, by all means, by all means.
Someone brought up remasters and remakes. Something I wanted to point out. I actually produced some classic game remasters. And sometimes the play isn't nostalgia so much as this game hasn't been on sale in 30 years. They put it back in print. So I just want to point that out real quick.
And that's an excellent point. It's not necessarily nostalgia. It's just limited.
It's just,
Preservation.
Yeah. And then the other thing I want to bring up is, you're talking about Ready Player One and how all of this stuff that he references is around. It's not like it's gone. And I actually have read that book.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There it is, unintentionally. And sort of one of the core books that Ernie tries to give you with that book is pages of descriptions of the protagonist having instant access to every episode of Alf ever made. And, he can emulate any Atari game ever whenever he feels like it. And it just strikes me that like we all have that in our pockets right now, access to like every piece of media ever made, and I don't understand how nostalgia as a commercial driver can exist much longer when I can access all of this stuff right now. And it just, that's what's most interesting to me right now about nostalgia. Is like, is it about to crash?
I don't know if it's about to crash, but it will eventually. If they don't take their foot off the gas, there's a bubble that will pop. It will crash.
Well, I'm not sure, because the problem now that we have is the selection aspect. So even if we have access to these materials, we may not know to access them. The next generation may not know to access them. So even though they're there, it's like they aren't. So I think that there is a value in these trends bringing back these properties and ideas so that we can know to access them, to keep that conversation going.
I think it's fair.
Just real quick.
No, go. If it's quick, be quick.
Kind of what he was saying, that I think a good example of a good nostalgia, for me, it's subtlety. Like you mentioned, Yacht Club games, Shovel Knight series, and the first season of Stranger Things.
Yeah.
Nostalgia was good because it was subtle. You weren't like, and then I think a good example of a bad was Stranger Things season 2, where nostalgia was much more in your face and much more.
I don't know. What if Aliens was Gremlins? I actually kind of liked. We got one way in the back. Back center. You're the guy.
One thing I found kind of interesting in these last few years, the Ratchet and Clank movie they made.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was like really surprising to me because Ratchet and Clank started out as like just like it was like back during like the punk rock days.
Yes.
Like you just had like this like I don't know what he is, cat guy with a smart mouth and witty companion, and like they had all these games come out, and his Ratchet and Clank's identity were kind of solidified into that, and like when you think about them, you think about to the PS2 days, and now they come out with the movie and the game, and it seems like they're trying to a reinvention, I guess, of Ratchet and Clank, and trying to use them to get into the Disney market. And I know they're doing it with Sly Cooper too, and I think some other Sony IPs. That reinvention that I think we're seeing there, and I think in some other areas, is pretty interesting. But it's not really playing on nostalgia, I feel.
Yes and no, though? Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the movie was, I wanted to watch it. The voice was good. It was interesting, and it feels like it's very easy to translate one media into another, and for it to just be lol, first movie, get all these jokes, you get it. And that one actually, so, I mean, maybe it will work because I felt like it maintained a voice and engaged me, so.
Well, and sort of to take it sort of forward to the conclusion I wanted to get us to. Well, there'll be more question time too, which is when the game that got me going on this, aside from the trailer for Saturday Morning RPG, was the actual game Cosmic Star Heroine. And if you check it out, it's Z-Boyd Games. They did the 3rd and 4th Penny Arcade games, which you're much more likely to have played. And they have actually got a really clever approach to RPG design. But if you look at the game, if you just look at the game, there's really obvious Chrono Trigger and Phantasy Star influences. The world building it's a Shadowrun campaign. It's just a Shadowrun campaign. But then you get into the gameplay mechanics, and they have just this great combat engine. Basically, all of your guys, they can use their special attacks, or not just their special attacks, all of their attacks. They can use them once. And once it's expended, you have to waste a turn to recharge your abilities. And that simple mechanic, eliminating an MP system or anything like that, really changes your strategic approach to how you fight even the regular monsters. And you wind up with this great sort of comboing system where you can power guys up and just deliver massive hits. And it becomes really satisfying and really fun in a brand new way.
I think what's interesting as you're saying that, what's a kind of an aha moment I'm realizing is that creation is successful versus imitation because it's not taking a superficial element of nostalgia and just copying that. It's taking something deeper within the spirit of that property and making it into something fresh and new.
But finding that core piece, the reason why you liked the thing that it's referencing, and not just taking the thing that it's referencing, but taking that core. So that, Cosmic Star Heroine is a game that reminded me of Chrono Trigger. It reminded me of Phantasy Star, but it never tried to be those things. It never said, here's more Chrono Trigger. I made another Chrono Trigger. Good for you, I've already got Chrono Trigger. This was a brand new Cosmic Star Heroine that I'd never played before.
Yeah, and I think a fantastic example of a game that does that is Undertale, because, well, it started as an Earthbound mod, so there's that spirit of Earthbound that's there. But I think what's so fantastic, I never played Earthbound as a kid, so there wasn't that sense of reminiscing, but there was
played it last year.
So. Yeah, I just started playing it now because after Undertale I was like, ooh, Earthbound sounds interesting. But what was so fascinating about Undertale is I think it took an element that was great in Earthbound 2, which is the element of surprise and subverting our expectations, which to me was just invoking the experience of playing video games for the first time as a kid. I remember thinking they were magical and godlike. Like a kid had a Game Boy and I was like, shit, how do you carry this world in your pocket? Like, what is this? And so playing Undertale and them changing things on me all the time, I felt that same kid whoa, that just happened? That can happen? What? And so I think Toby Fox succeeded at grabbing the spirit of games at large, of what games initially were, and made a new one instead of just copying and pasting what we've been doing recently.
And it's great because, how many of you guys have played Undertale? Okay. Awesome, because we'll probably hit a couple of mild spoilers in here, which is a real shame for any of you guys who haven't played it, and I apologize in advance. If you want to run out the door, I don't blame you. Because literally the first thing that happens to you in that game is a subversion of expectation. There's a tutorial character shows up, is like, I'm going to show you how to play the game, and he's lying to you. And going all the way to again, trying to keep the spoilers to a minimum here. What happens to your game save file if you complete the genocide path? It will permanently alter your game's file so that if you try to play another path on another playthrough, things happen. It remembers what you did. And just to go off topic for just a moment, because this is the nostalgia panel, not an empathy panel, but it is one of that game is one of the most effective tools for building empathy I've ever experienced. Because I got about a third of the way into the game, and I didn't want to fight the monsters anymore.
Yeah. And this is another game I want to bring up that it relates to creating, but it also kind of has some questions in there that when we get to the audience questions again, I'd like to hear some responses. So one that I think of a lot that started making me think about nostalgia a lot was the FNAF series, and particularly through the mini games. Well, there's multiple things about it, but one, the mini games intrigued me because they take Atari graphics and impose them in this 3D, in sections in a 3D game, which for me was interesting in recreating through the absence of details, something about invoking an experience of the mystery and unfamiliarity of older games, where we had to kind of fill in the gaps, especially for something that's horror-driven. But another thing was taking something that is nostalgic in our memory, like animatronic pizza parlors, and distorting them. So something that interests me about this, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on, is the idea of, we talked about nostalgia as being personal and relative. So it's very interesting talking to people about FNAF that you talk to 20, 30 plus year olds and they're like, oh my gosh, that game scares the crap out of me. But then you talk to an 8-year-old kid and they're like, it's so much fun. And so that's really interesting to me, that I wonder if you demand and require some sort of nostalgic background for that game to be terrifying. You have to remember what Chuck E. Cheese was like as a kid, or some perception of what that kind of experience was, and to see that distorted for it to be creepy. And if you don't have any experience with that, then you're just like, oh, well, it's fun. Or maybe not, but that's something that I kind of wonder if that emotional dissonance is what makes that game have a certain effect on people.
Well, one of the things that we were talking about before, though, was the idea that, you know, a really good piece of creative nostalgia is something that reminds you of that thing without being that thing. So, you know, if you don't have the context to be reminded of it, it changes the experience completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say, that's amazing you made that point because it all comes clear to me now. That's why my nephew's not afraid of it because he didn't grow up with showbiz and seeing these things that we thought were creepy, and now it's, thank you. It's really everything for me, sorry.
Yay!
Gentleman right behind you.
Yeah, I didn't see the movie myself, but your comment on like the robotic animatronics reminded me of Team America World Police and how they used the puppets and how that's reminiscent of like the Thundercats from way back.
Thunderbirds.
Thunderbirds.
Yeah.
Baby.
But I'm wondering if you can draw any parallels between that and that, because I know when I saw it, I just thought it was like it fell into uncanny valley. I thought it was really creepy, but for someone who actually grew up with that, how would your experience differ?
I think because I have seen the movie and I am familiar with the Thunderbirds, it really it's one of those expectation subversion things like we were talking about with Undertale, where like the tone of how many of you guys are familiar with the Thunderbirds puppet show? It's weird and it's low conflict and like it's very sedate, and then something like Team America is like all the way the other direction. And I think it's that juxtaposition I think is what they were going for there, and I think in that context it worked. Oh.
So you mentioned Cuphead earlier.
Yeah.
So what do you think is kind of going on there, right? Because it's like there's the genre of game is one part of nostalgia, right? Like, they don't really make 2D run and gun, Contra, Gunstar Hero. I mean, the game is basically a copy of Alien Soldier by Treasure, and it's a series of boss battles in that format. But then the style of the game is this nostalgia for something that, like, originally very few people who are still alive probably have, because the cartoons that it's aping are from like before my grandparents were born, right? But then, like, I saw a lot of those style cartoons on like the Bozo the Clown show. You know, they showed the old Fleischer Studios Superman cartoons, and on Cartoon Network when it first started, they showed old Looney Tunes and all that kind of stuff. So like, what?
Or if you're a certain age, you remember Animaniacs.
Oh. There's like
this multi-layered sort of nostalgia with it. So I guess like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that's twofold nostalgia of the art style and the mechanics, because now that you say that, I think something really interesting about Cuphead, and actually Bendy and the Ink Machine a little bit too, is this adding this dimension of pulling out what made those cartoons kind of disturbing and creepy. Like the ones that Bendy was based off of, like, I mean, there was some really weird shit going on. And so like, I feel like these games are like allowing us to talk about that more instead of pretending like it was all cool and like they're all just happy. Like the violence of the mechanics, and I think of the flower, like I will never be able to unsee that creepy flower from Cuphead. Like, I don't know, I feel like it embraced it a little bit without embracing it. Like Bendy, I think, embraces it like a lot more. So there's like an interesting balance of how those mechanics work well with that cartoon style. Yeah, but maybe we're not bringing background of seeing it as a kid in the same way. I mean, I saw them on like Cartoon Network, I guess, played those kind of things, but it wasn't the same cultural context as somebody who grew up and that was like the cartoon style. So it's different.
And I think that's great too, because you know it's the same thing we were just talking about with Thunderbirds and Team America. Yeah. It's the same thing we're talking about with Undertale, especially the final boss battle in Undertale, which has just such a great juxtaposition of stuff you don't expect to see. That juxtaposition takes you out of a comfort zone. So like if nostalgia is all about embracing a comfort zone, these really great nostalgia products, in my opinion, are the ones that take you into that comfort zone and then just violently shove you out of it.
Yes.
Like you're having your cake and eating it too, in a way.
Yeah.
All right, right there in the brown hoodie. Yes, you.
It's red.
Oh.
No, about...
Looks brown from here. I'm sorry.
No, about Cuphead being nostalgic, I don't feel like it is. Because
like you said, no one that grew up with those old style cartoons is really alive anymore. And there have been like reiterations of it over time, but that like original nostalgia-ness isn't really there. I think it really just stands out because it's so different. Same with Bendy. Like there are very few games that are going for that style. Like when you say retro, everyone probably assumes 8, 16-bit,
Right.
whatever. And the fact that like these games have such a drastically different art style and stick to it so hard. Like you said in Cuphead, how they just like hand animated everything.
Yeah, for serious.
They really just went all out for that, and I think that's why they're like so successful. And then like the gameplay is just very simple, but like difficult to actually master and complete. Like the controls are easy, but you need to like really be precise with it and everything. And I think it's more that than nostalgia, if anything. That it's just like.
Well, at a certain point, nostalgia isn't nostalgia anymor. It's something that's so old that it's new again.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like kind of what it is with Cuphead and Bendy, is that like these games with these like old school animation styles are like just really sticking out amongst everything else.
Red shirt in the back?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. A lot of that stuff that was, a lot of that nostalgia for stuff that, older stuff that used to be nostalgia of that era, called back. And it ends up being kind of recursive. Everything goes into it. Like when we talk about stuff that's nostalgic, like the Disney era, like the 50s, almost a lot of the stuff that was done there was nostalgic of the 1990s. Almost everything Disney made then was based on this nostalgia of the 1890s, 1900s, and even and that kind of also goes back. So kind of it's folded into that.
So it is a cycle. It is a wheel.
Yeah, all this is pretty much the 70s is nostalgic of the 50s, nostalgic of the like the 30s, is nostalgic of the 1890s. It all filed, it all comes, it all holds in. It builds up to a new thing pretty much.
Yeah, very true.
Real quick. I just wanted to point out that the Cuphead aesthetic, the reason that people are aware of it is because those cartoons fell in that sweet spot where they entered the public domain.
Yes.
Extensions have been, so people
The public domain.
So it's not
The
that
public
people
domain.
were nostalgic for the 30s. It's that
Right.
they were exposed to these things because they could be not posted.
Yeah, so there's definitely a distinction. I think you guys have made some great points that maybe nostalgia isn't the factor, though I think nostalgia, like we've said, is personal and subjective, so for some there might be some nostalgic pull, but if there is, it's a different nostalgia than, say, FNAF taking certain cultural context and memories. It's a much more superficial of a level of like, oh, hey, I saw some Merry Melodies cartoons, maybe as a kid.
Mario.
I think a mentionable title here is Banjo-Kazooie.
Oh, yes.
So like part 1 and 2, everyone loves it, right? And years later, you know, Xbox comes out with Nuts and Bolts, right? And I think everyone was collectively disappointed by that game. I think they were trying to like use Banjo-Kazooie as tools to kind of pawn off this build a race car game. I just think no one was expecting it. Maybe somebody liked the game, but I was very disappointed. I would have loved so much for it to be like a Mario Odyssey story where you got this awesome game built on the same principles.
And I mean, I guess that's a big part of it too, actually, that we didn't really dip into, that we didn't really have time to dip into, which is the idea of who is curating these IPs. What are their feelings for them? How are they treating them? Are they recreating them? Are they doing something new with them? Like there is, I could engage every single one of you for many days talking about the various ways the Star Wars franchise has been treated by the various people in charge of it. But yeah, so who's doing the curating has just a massive effect on what your final product is going to be, what the nature of that product is, and again, is it any fun? Does anybody like it? All right, so let me check the time real quick here.
We got
6 minutes, which I think is probably enough time for 3 questions. All right, so you up front?
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but I think nostalgia is really just it's a really good feeling, so especially someone that's,
you know, has been through.
Pringles are getting away.
Who's been through, you know, different kinds of things when we were a kid. So, like, for example, when they came out with Crash Bandicoot and Insanity, I might have said it wrong, my bad. But I don't think in my perspective, I don't think this generation now has I don't know what's the word, they haven't, what we've gone through and how much hard work we've been, you know, playing different games and how hard it is to get to this level. And, you know, I don't know, I think they won't experience that, you know?
And I think actually in a weird way, I was looking for a way to fit this into the panel and I couldn't find it, so you just gave it to me. I think in a big way, Dark Souls and the Dark Souls alike, they are nostalgia driven for a time when games were very hard. And the thing is, if you're like me and you play games for several decades of your life, at a certain point you get good enough at them that they're not that hard anymore. So a harder experience is nostalgia driven in a sense for people like me. All right, in the blue.
Hi. So a little while ago in the panel, we were talking about like over time companies possibly like in the future like driving nostalgia into the ground through like overuse and oversaturation. And I think a really good example of that you kind of like briefly mentioned earlier in the panel on like a more specific level is Green Hill Zone. Basically, since like Sonic Generations came out in 2011, Sega has, like, Sonic Team has had Green Hill Zone or a Green Hill Zone like variant or like Green Hill Zone alike in pretty much every Sonic game since then, and it's gotten to the point where a lot of people who've been following Sonic games are just absolutely sick of it. And it's even getting to the point now where I think that's starting to also happen to things like Chemical Plant Zone as well, that are starting to get
There's a reason I called that one out specifically.
Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up like that as a more like prominent example of that.
All right,
I
who?
don't know if there's necessarily a question attached to that. I just
Okay, so actually, because people.
happening now as well. Like the process is starting to begin, maybe.
All right.
Extreme levels.
So one more question. Let's make it a good one. Who's got a good question to end this on? Dead center. How can I argue with that?
What do you think the line is between a product being similar and being a carbon copy ripoff? Because it seems audiences will be very judgmental if a new sci-fi movie has something similar to Lightsaber, and they're going to call it out as being ripoff. But something like Cuphead, which is basically Steamboat Willie, is praised for its creativity. Where is the line drawn between the two?
I sent some salt there.
I asked for a good question. I got one.
I think Stardew Valley is a good thing for that question.
Well, I think answer number one is we're the problem because we suck. We can't just love things.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Part of the line, I think, too, it is not just, okay, they got laser swords. What are they doing with the laser swords? Is it something, do we have a fresh take on laser swords here? I don't know if there is a fresh take on laser swords anywhere. But is there a fresh take? Is there some element of innovation? Is there some attempt to bridge from recreation to creation? Or even from imitation to recreation? And like, can we get past that first hurdle? And I think in general, and I'm speaking for a lot of people that I probably don't have the authority to speak for, I think in general that if you can give us something new, a new spin on that, a new take on that, a new direction for that familiar item, I think then the crowds are more likely to be more forgiving on it.
And I think the context in which it's being used, which I think is related, but feeling like, yeah, that there's something about the spirit that's being captured, but it's doing something new, so that you can feel like it's justified, I guess is what I'm saying. Of like, it's not just, oh, I'm taking this property because this property seems cool, but it's being used in such a way where it's like, oh, that makes sense.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time. You have been wonderful. We thank you so much for coming out to listen to us. So otherwise, we're just talking to an empty room. We will do that. Don't think we won't. Thank you so much for coming out. We appreciate it so much. Don't applaud me. You guys are MAGFest. You guys are MAGFest.